On July 17th, 1944, at 10:18 p.m, there was a blinding flash that filled the night sky with flames. Then, a tremendous sound like a thunderclap reverberated throughout the entire town of Port Chicago. More flashes could be seen, beautiful, like fireworks, followed by a dull orange glow that hung in the night sky. Then, it all went black. This was the USA's deadliest homeland disaster during World War II. 2 ammunition ships at the Port Chicago Naval Base exploded, instantly killing anyone within a 900-metre radius. The 320 men that were loading the ships with ammunition lost their lives, and 400 more were severely injured. Charred flesh rained down from the sky, the pier was obliterated, and much of the nearby town of Port Chicago was destroyed. Now, most of the casualties were African American sailors. You see, the port was segregated. It was only the black sailors that had the dangerous job of loading the ships. The Navy tried to quietly sweep the disaster under the rug, ordering the surviving black sailors to go straight back to work like nothing had happened. But hundreds of them refused. They were taking a stand against the hazardous working conditions, against the unequal treatment. The Navy decided that this was mutiny, and the penalty would be death by firing squad. With the threat of execution, many of the sailors understandably agreed to go back to work, but 50 wouldn't. They refused to give in. Now, we all remember Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, but before them, there was the Port Chicago 50. This is their story. It's a story of tragedy, tremendous bravery, and a fight for change. On the 7th of December 1941, a torpedo had just slammed into the USS West Virginia at the US Naval Base in Pearl Harbor. "The Japanese are attacking! All hands! General quarters!" a voice boomed over the loudspeaker. Doris Miller, an African-American mess attendant, sprang into action, rushing to his battle station, only to find that it had already been destroyed. He then ran up to the deck to seek reassignment. The scene that awaited him was one of pure chaos and devastation. The deck was engulfed by flames, bombs were falling from the sky, and debris and bullets were flying all around. The communications officer spotted Doris, noticing that he looked muscular and capable. The officer ordered him to help save the captain, who lay dying from a deep wound to the abdomen. Doris helped lift him to a sheltered spot behind the conning tower. The ship, it had now been hit by 2 bombs and 6 Japanese torpedoes, which left gaping holes in their wake. Water flooded in and the ship was drastically tilting to the left. Doris was now helping to feed ammo to an anti-aircraft machine gun, whilst one of the lieutenants fired away at the incoming Japanese planes. As Doris surveyed the chaos surrounding him, he spotted that the second gunner was dead. The gun was now unmanned. He knew exactly what he had to do to protect his crewmates, to protect his country. Segregation be damned. He fought his way through the billowing smoke and the heat of the fires and then jumped behind the gun. He had no training in how to use the weapon, but it would turn out that he was natural. He opened fire and took down at least 2 enemy planes. "Abandon ship!" the dying captain called out. Doris once again leapt into action and began helping wounded crew members get off the ship, before finally getting himself to safety. Doris was one of the first heroes of the Second World War, and he was awarded the Navy Cross.
What an absolute legend. I bet he got a huge promotion after that heroic display.
Nope, I'm afraid not. He was praised for his distinguished devotion to duty, his extraordinary courage and disregard for his own personal safety. But, despite all of this, he would remain a mess attendant, because at the time, this was all a black man could be in the US Navy. It didn't matter how many deeds of heroism black servicemen carried out, or how many times throughout history they helped to turn the tide of battle. It wouldn't shake the firmly held belief that black men were worthless as combat soldiers. As the US readied itself for World War II, calls for the Navy to desegregate fell on deaf ears. Racism and segregation was so deeply ingrained into US society, and it certainly wasn't the Navy's problem to fix. They refused to budge on that absolutely ridiculous policy, which meant that black men could pretty much only be seagoing bellhops. But pressure from civil rights groups mounted, and President Roosevelt, well, he realised he would need support from black voters in the next election. So, a compromise was reached. In April 1942, the Navy announced that it would now begin accepting black volunteers for training as sailors. Sounds absolutely fabulous on the surface, but not so much if you read the fine print. The black volunteers would still be restricted to the lowest of ranks. After the announcement, young black men were lining up round the block, eager to serve their country. They hoped that by fighting and dying in the service that they would get better rights, that if they could just prove themselves in combat, that they'd no longer be treated like second-class citizens. It's awful. Imagine feeling like you need to risk your life to get rights that you should already be entitled to be treated as an equal human being. Robert Ralph was only 17 and so he needed a parent's signature to enlist. He pleaded with his parents. "If you sign for me," he told his dad, "I can help make the country a better place for us blacks." Percy Robinson and Jack Crittenden were still in high school when they were drafted. Like many of their peers, they hoped that by serving they could prove that black men were not cowards. Freddie Meeks was 24 and Joseph Small was 22, and they were some of the older recruits. Now Joe would go on to play a pivotal role in the events yet to come. You see, he was a natural born leader, somebody that people just looked up to, and these were traits that the Navy would use against him. Joe and the other recruits were shipped off to the Great Lakes Training Center in Illinois. Now, I need to point out that many of these men were just children, they were teenagers. They weren't old enough to vote or even have a legal drink. Some were so eager to serve that they lied about their age, enlisting at just 16. As soon as they arrived at the training centre, they were made to feel unwelcome, othered. Everything was segregated. The lines to get food, where you ate, where you slept, where you trained, bands, sports teams, you name it. Now, black recruits, they didn't get the same opportunities as their white counterparts. You see, their petty officers wouldn't allow them to apply for programs that trained sailors to be electricians or radiomen or mechanics. Even the blood supply was segregated.
Wait, did they think there was a difference between the blood of black and white men?
Nope, the military leaders were fully aware that there was no difference, but this was just how it always had been, and no one was willing to change it. It didn't matter that it was a complete waste of everybody's time and money. The black recruits underwent intensive training. For 12 weeks they marched, they exercised, they swam, and they learnt how to use rifles. But importantly, they had absolutely no training in how to handle explosives. They never expected to need this though. They all assumed that they'd be fighting aboard ships at sea. They expected to be sailors like any other in the Navy. Once their training was complete, they boarded trains headed somewhere. They were filled with a nervous excitement for their first assignment. They weren't sure where they were going, the Navy had kept them in the dark about that, but they were eager to start serving their country. Finally, they arrived at the Port Chicago Naval Magazine on the banks of the Suisun Bay in California. Now, in the words of Freddie Meeks, it was a dumpy-looking place way back there in the boondocks. Freddie and the others were driven down to the waterfront, where they saw crews of sailors lifting bombs and crates of ammunition out of boxcars and loading them onto ships. They quickly noticed that it was only the black sailors loading the ships, while the white officers stood giving orders. The new recruits grumbled in private. They didn't want to be there. They wanted to fight for their country. And the commanding officer, well, he didn't want them there either. He felt that black workers could only do about 60% as much work as whites. It was straight to work for the new recruits. Joe thought that they'd at least get some kind of training, but no. They were just expected to handle torpedo warheads and massive incendiary bombs without the slightest bit of safety training. There wasn't even a manual for them to read. The white officers, on the other hand, who wouldn't be handling the explosives, I might add, were giving a brief course on the safe handling of bombs and ammunition. It wasn't much, but at least it was something.
What was the Navy thinking? Why wouldn't you train the people actually doing the dangerous work?
Now, apparently, and this is truly disgusting, they felt that because of the men's level of intelligence and education, they'd be incapable of learning. Working at the port was grueling, and the pace, it was unrelenting. But the recruits took solace in the fact that their work was vital. Lots of ammunition was needed for the war effort, and from here it was shipped out to the Pacific Theatre. Loading happened around the clock, with each division working an 8-hour shift. The ammunition was brought in by rail on boxcars, and the bombs would be stacked up to 6 high inside. The men would open up the car doors and set up a ramp from the top of the bombs down to the pier, and then they would roll the bombs down. Sometimes the bombs were packed in so tightly they'd have to use a crowbar to try and wrangle them out. Mattresses would be hung on the sides of the ship to lessen the blow when the shells inevitably careened off the ramp and hit the metal walls of the ship. Boom, thud and clink could be heard all day long. The ammunition was transferred into nets attached to a crane, which would lift and lower the bombs down into the ship's hold. The crew in the hold would then unload the ammo in the ship. They'd build themselves up, stacking and stacking until they found themselves on top. Then, lastly, the hot cargo would be placed carefully at the top of the pile. And this was the most dangerous part of all. These were 650-pound incendiary bombs. And, unlike the other explosives, these already had their fuses attached.
What? Surely this was just a disaster waiting to happen.
Yep, 100%, and the men knew it too. They shuddered with each thud, boom and clink. Was this it? Was this the impact that would cause everything to explode? One day, Percy Robinson was standing on a pile of ammunition in the hold. A bomb slipped from the net and banged into the side of the ship with great force. Everyone froze, their hearts pounding. There was silence for a moment, then a loud hissing sound as a red substance started gushing out of the bomb. This was it, they thought. They began clamouring for the exits, climbing over each other, trying to get out. There was such a fight to get out that some sailors even broke their legs. The sailors collapsed onto the pier, exhausted and scared. Very cruelly, they were met with laughter from the white officers. It was just dye. It would spray out on impact so that the crews could see where their bombs had hit during combat. No one had told them this though, how were they to know? Percy, Joe and the others called for training, pleaded for training, but it wasn't going to happen. The San Francisco waterfront unions warned that an explosion could happen any day now. The working conditions, they were hazardous, and the safety regulations were not being followed. The unions even offered to send experienced men to train the Navy recruits, but the Navy never responded. The white officers tried to convince the loaders that there was no chance of accidental explosion, but they weren't stupid. They knew that they were playing with fire. In April 1944, Captain Kinney arrived and he took over as the new commander at Port Chicago. He wanted the workers to quicken their pace. You see, speed was of course more important than safety. He decided that a bit of competition was the answer. So, the daily tonnage moved by each division was plastered on a chalkboard for all to see. It started off innocently enough. The division that moved the most would be rewarded with things like free movies. But soon, the division leaders started racing the divisions, placing bets on whose division could load the most. And God help you if you lost the bet for your lieutenant. You'd have to face their ire, and my goodness, could they be vindictive. The lieutenant of Joe's division, Lieutenant DeLucci, was very hot-tempered and very quick to punish. Luckily for Joe, he managed to stay on DeLucci's good side. DeLucci could see Joe's natural leadership ability, and so gave him the role of official cadence caller for the division. The recruits began to look up to Joe, often coming to him for help instead of their petty officer. Every 8th day, the sailors would get a Liberty Day, where they were free to do whatever they liked. Joe and many of the other young men loved to hop on a bus and get away from the base and the nearby town of Port Chicago. The town of Port Chicago was about 1.5 miles away, but it was just a one-street place, and the townspeople, well, they didn't care for black people. Though, to be honest, it didn't really matter where they went. They were often made to feel unwelcome, even when wearing their Navy uniforms. Bars and restaurants wouldn't serve them and they were accosted in the street. Sadly, their experiences were not unique. A group of black soldiers were travelling to a new base, and as luck would have it, they'd had to stop over in a small Louisiana town. Hungry, they went looking for a place to eat, but restaurant after restaurant after restaurant turned them away. Finally, they found an establishment that would serve them, but only if they came in through the back entrance and ate standing up in the kitchen. Now, if you thought this was bad, well, the worst is yet to come. As the soldiers stood standing up and eating, they saw a group of German prisoners of war guarded by 2 American soldiers. They walked straight in through the front entrance, were greeted warmly, and seated in the main area. They were served right away. The Germans sat, happily eating in comfort, laughing, drinking, and smoking cigarettes.
Wait, I thought the Germans were the enemy.
I did too, but apparently they were worthy of better treatment than the black Americans who were prepared to fight and die for their country. Should I sacrifice my life to live half American? James Thompson famously wrote in to the Pittsburgh Courier, and this was a letter that would spark the Double V for Victory campaign. You see, black Americans were courageously fighting two wars: fascism abroad and racism at home. July 17th, 1944 was a glorious day. The sky was clear and the sun was shining brightly. Joe Small and the rest of his division finished their shift at 3 p.m. and headed back to the barracks. Today was a Liberty Day for Spencer Sykes. He was an avid reader and he usually spent the evening in his bunk with a book. But this evening, he got a phone call asking if he fancied seeing a movie in town. Why not, he thought. He got himself nicely spruced up and at 6 p.m. he headed to the bus stop. The sun began to set and the floodlights lit up the pier as two other divisions loaded ammunition into the E.A. Bryan and prepared to load the Quinault Victory. By 9 p.m. the holes of the Bryan were filled and the hot cargo was placed carefully at the top. Sailors in the barracks that were a mile away from the pier were getting ready for bed, and at 10 p.m. the lights out announcement rang out over the loudspeakers. Joe Small settled into his bunk and smiled to himself as he thought about his upcoming date with a lovely lady he'd been seeing. Aunt Ralph put on his acne cream, hoping to get rid of those pesky pimples, the bane of nearly every teen's life. He then said his prayers and hopped into bed. At 10:18 p.m, Joe heard an almighty sound like a thunderclap coming from the direction of the pier. "Oh my God, we're being bombed!" shouted one of the sailors. Percy and Robert began to instinctively look out of the window to see what was going on. Then there was a second, much larger explosion. The sky lit up just like as if the sun had risen, and there were tremendous, beautiful flashes in the sky like at a 4th of July celebration. The shockwave from the blast tore through the barracks, and the windows shattered, spraying glass in all directions. The shards of glass, like knives, ripped through Percy's skin, causing severe lacerations to most of his upper body. Robert's eyes were pierced with shards of glass, and now he couldn't see what was going on. Joe Small flew up into the air, his mattress right behind him. He rotated in the air before landing on the ground, face first, his mattress on top of him. Now, thank goodness for that mattress, because it acted like a shield as shards of glass and splinters of wood rained down. Panic screams filled the air as men were hit with a barrage of glass and debris. Then there was a creak and a groan as the building started to give way. "Get out of the barracks, it's coming down!" someone cried. The men got out any which way they could, crawling, limping, dragging and carrying those that were too injured to move. Most buildings in the nearby town of Port Chicago were badly damaged by the blast. People were knocked off their feet, out of chairs, and were sent flying across rooms. In the Port Chicago movie theatre, a war movie was being shown, and as luck would have it, a bombing scene was playing just as the explosion took place. Now, of course, the moviegoers thought that the huge thunderclap they heard was part of the film, but then the wall of the theatre gave way, and the roof began to cave in. Spencer Sykes was 30 miles away from Port Chicago, sitting in another movie theatre. Even here, the thunderous roar of the blast could be heard, and the building began to quake. Back at the base, Joe Small could see injured men everywhere, and tried to help where he could. One man's feet were bleeding terribly, so Joe gave him his shoes. There were no medics around, so everyone just had to help each other as best they could. A group of sailors gathered to go and help any survivors down at the pier. Percy volunteered, not realising how badly injured he was. The leader of the group took one look at him and told him that he needed to go straight to the hospital. The group bundled into a truck and drove down towards the pier. The driver stopped abruptly. The pier? Well, it was gone, and the ships had been obliterated too. The men looked out at the water. There was nothing left. There were no survivors. Their friends were dead. 320 men lost their lives that day, and 2/3 of them were black. At the hospital, one of Robert Ralph's eyes had to be removed, and the other was so badly lacerated that he was now blind. Spencer Sykes arrived back at the barracks and saw that his pillow had been impaled by 2 large shards of glass that had rooted their way deep into the mattress beneath. That trip to the movies had saved his life. After the explosion, the white officers were given a 30-day leave to recuperate and see their families. The black sailors, the ones that actually handled the explosives, were not given any time off, and their requests for leave were refused. This, understandably, led to a feeling of resentment. How could the Navy show them such a lack of compassion? Then, to add insult to injury, the next day, the Navy would order the surviving black sailors to go and clean up the mess. Jack Crittenden was part of the cleanup team, and it was a scene that he would never forget. You'd see a shoe with a foot in it, a head floating across the water, or an arm, he said. They found gloves and shoes mostly. These had held the body parts together. The smell of the bodies was overwhelming, and the men had to scoop up the charred flesh of their dead friends and put it into buckets. Now, I can't imagine how absolutely horribly traumatic that must have been for them. There were over 300 people killed by the blast, and only 51 bodies were left intact enough to be identified. 4 days after the explosion, the Navy held an inquiry into the cause of the disaster. Slight snag there though, anyone that was close enough to see what went wrong was dead. Now of course, Captain Kinney and the division leaders who were racing the men against each other, they weren't at fault. It wasn't the lack of training or the unsafe working conditions. Oh no, the problem was the black sailors. The official report, based on witness testimony given by the white officers, stated that the enlisted personnel are neither temperamentally nor intellectually capable of handling high explosives. It's absolutely appalling that they tried to put the blame on the black sailors that had lost their lives. Ultimately, though, no one was held accountable. The Navy asked Congress to give up to $5,000 of compensation to victims of the disaster. John Rankin, a House member from Mississippi, objected, though. This amount was far too much because most of the people that would be getting the money would be black. Congress then reduced the maximum compensation to $3,000. So clearly, Congress agreed that black lives were worth less. Robert Ralph, who was blinded in the disaster, was initially awarded just $41 for his injuries. He had to fight for years to get decent compensation. The surviving black sailors were transferred from Port Chicago to a nearby base, Camp Shoemaker. As usual, the men were kept in the dark. They didn't know what the Navy had planned for them. They were all in a state of absolute shock and mourning the death of their friends. The sight and smell of their bodies' blackened remains were still firmly ingrained in their minds. Everyone was on edge, jumping and diving for shelter at the slightest noise. They received no help from the Navy to come to terms with what had happened. At the start of August, the men were then moved to the Mare Island Naval Shipyard. A list started circulating around the barracks. It was a petition requesting a change of duty. You see, the men were far too frightened to go back to loading ammunition. They needed change, proper training. How could they go back and work under those same conditions that caused the explosion? It was now clear that the Navy just saw them as expendable, just cannon fodder. Now, Joe Small made sure that that list was destroyed. He knew that it was best to have nothing in writing. He said that once you have your name on a list, then you become a supporting part of whatever that list stands for. Very wise words. On August 8th, Joe's division were all given work gloves, the same kind they had used for loading ammunition. There was a lot of chatter that night about what orders they might be given the next day. The next day, after lunch, Lieutenant DeLucci made an announcement on the loudspeaker. Division 4, turn 2 for work. The division began marching towards the river, with Joe Small calling cadence. Many of the men were still wrapped up in bandages, their wounds barely healed. They reached a branch in the road. Column left, DeLucci ordered. This meant that they'd be going back to loading ammunition, just like before, with no extra training, no explanation of what had gone wrong and what to do to prevent another explosion. Now, it's not clear what exactly happened next. Everyone seems to remember it differently, but the sailors came to a stop, banging into each other. "Forward march, column left," Delucci ordered. But no one moved an inch. "Will you go back to work?" Delucci asked. But no one answered. "Joe's a small front and centre," barked Delucci. "Small, are you going to go back to work?" Delucci demanded. "No, sir," Small responded. "If Small don't go, we don't go either," one of the men called out, and it was this remark that caused Joe to be seen as the spokesperson for the group. The men made it clear that they weren't refusing to work outright. They would do any other work, but they wouldn't handle ammunition under the same conditions. Delucci, of course, reported the incident to his superiors. The black sailors in the other divisions saw what was happening, and they followed suit. In total, 258 out of 328 sailors from 3 different divisions refused to go back to loading. Now, instead of listening to the men's concerns and offering to address the safety issues, they marched the men under armed guard to a prison barge where they were packed in like sardines. The only time the men were allowed off the barge was at mealtimes when they were marched down to the chow hall on base. Tensions on the barge began to rise. Some of the men wanted to give in and go back to loading ammunition, but others didn't. Joe noticed that a few men had been taking spoons and forks from the chow hall and fashioning them into knives. The Marines guarding the barge warned that they would shoot at the slightest provocation. Joe could see that something had to be done before there was a deadly confrontation between the sailors and the guards. He called a meeting. Little did he know that this would be something the Navy would use against him. Joe addressed the sailors. "The officers want us to do something, to mess up so they will have something on us. If we obey the shore patrol and the officers and we don't get into any trouble, they can't do anything to us. We've got the officers by the balls. If we stick together, they can't do anything to us." The speech worked. The men applauded and the tension dissipated. They made sure not to mess up. On the 3rd day, the men were marched off the barge and rounded up in a nearby field. They were surrounded by armed guards wielding machine guns. Admiral Wright, the commandant of the 12th Naval District, marched out onto that field, and after berating the men for quite a while, he made it clear that their conduct was mutiny, and the penalty would be death by firing squad. Fear swept through the men as they heard the words mutiny and death. They never ever imagined that their actions could be considered mutiny. They were taking a stand against unsafe working conditions and racial injustice. They hadn't tried to overthrow anyone. The men were told to line up behind the lieutenants if they agreed to go back to loading. A life-changing moment. Men wept as they picked sides. Friends split, brothers split, some quickly moved back and forth, struggling to decide. In total, 50 men would refuse to go back to loading. Joe Small was among these. The 50 men would go on to be known as the Port Chicago 50. The men who agreed to go back to work were convicted of disobeying orders and had to forfeit 3 months' pay. Admiral Wright demanded to speak to Joe in private. He saw Joe as the leader of the group, and he knew that if Joe went back to loading, everyone else would. Joe refused though. He wouldn't work under those same conditions. "If you don't return to work, I'm going to have you shot," Admiral Wright shouted. "You ball-headed son of a so-and-so. Go ahead and shoot," Joe responded. He was not going to be intimidated into backing down. The Port Chicago 50 were charged with mutiny and faced either death or a lengthy prison sentence. The trial began on September the 14th, and it would be the largest mass trial in the history of the United States Navy. The Navy let the press attend, hoping to make an example of these men who had dared to take a stand. But it backfired. Instead, it brought to light the issue of racial discrimination in the Navy. The trial was an absolute farce. It was fixed from the beginning. The 7-member court of white men, who would act as judge and jury, were led by Admiral Osterhaus. Now, decades after the trial, it was revealed that Admiral Osterhaus was overheard saying, "We're going to find them guilty," and this was while the accused were still testifying. The defence was led by Lieutenant Veltman and the prosecution by Lieutenant Coakley. Coakley's strategy was to argue that the Port Chicago 50 had conspired together to refuse to work, and Joe, well, he was the ringleader of this mutinous conspiracy. He'd called that absolutely scandalous top-secret meeting on the barge, remember? The one to try and stop any violence. Coakley also harped on and on about that list that had been circulated around the barracks, but thank goodness Joe had had it destroyed, so there was no written evidence. Now, Veltman, he focused on the Navy's definition of mutiny. There had to be a deliberate purpose to usurp, subvert or override authority. The Port Chicago 50 had refused a specific order, but they hadn't tried to seize power, so they certainly weren't guilty of mutiny. The men were in shock, frightened. They weren't refusing to work outright, just to load ammunition under the same conditions. Some of the most important testimony was provided by Deadliest, the hot-headed lieutenant of Joe's division. Apparently, it was evidence of conspiracy. Now, he claimed that he heard some of the men say, "Don't go and work for the white mother." Now, Deadliest didn't see who made these remarks because his back was turned, so he couldn't confirm whether it was any of the accused. I also need to add in another shocking fact here. It would turn out that Deadliest was the brother-in-law of Lieutenant Coakley, leader of the prosecution. Thurgood Marshall, the lead attorney for the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, the NAACP, sat in on the trial as an observer. He stated to the press that this is not 50 men on trial for mutiny. This is the Navy on trial for its whole vicious policy towards black people. On the 24th of October 1944, after just 80 minutes of deliberation, about a minute and a half each defendant, all 50 men were found guilty of mutiny. They were sentenced to 15 years of hard labour in prison and dishonourable discharge from the Navy. Some had their jail time reduced due to their young age. Over half of the men were under the age of 21. Thurgood Marshall was having none of this. He began working on an appeal. He argued that Deadliest's testimony was hearsay and inadmissible. The NAACP also raised awareness by circulating petitions and persuasive pamphlets calling for the mutiny convictions to be overturned. Even First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt was a supporter of the campaign. She sent a copy of one of the NAACP's pamphlets to the Secretary of the Navy with a nice little handwritten note. "I hope in the case of these boys, special care will be taken." Incidents like the one at Port Chicago, the race riot in Guam, and the hunger strike at Camp Rousseau made it increasingly clear that segregation in the Navy was actually hurting the war effort, causing low morale and unnecessary conflict. So, the Navy began a little experiment. Black sailors were integrated with a mostly white crew on 25 non-combat ships, and soon the first black naval officers were assigned to ships at sea. The integration was remarkably successful. The black sailors proved to be an asset to the crew and, surprise, surprise, eventually everyone got on. The Navy hoped that interest in the Port Chicago story would just die down and go away, but it didn't. There was a huge public outcry. After 16 months in jail, the men were finally released in January 1946 and returned to active duty at sea. The mutiny convictions were never overturned though, and they would hang over the men for the rest of their lives. Just 1 month after the men's release, the Navy would become the first branch of the US military to desegregate. Now, Port Chicago was an important catalyst for this. It drew attention to the racial injustices in the Navy, it sparked investigations by the NAACP, it sparked protests and public outcry. The Navy would now lead the way in showing that desegregation was possible and that it was beneficial to everyone. President Truman was watching, and he was impressed. So much so that he issued Executive Order 9981 in July 1948, ending segregation in all branches of the US military. To this day, the fight to exonerate the Port Chicago 50 continues. These men played a pivotal role in ending segregation in the Navy. They deserve to be exonerated, to be remembered as heroes in the fight for equality, not as mutineers. If you got something from this video, Gagi and I would really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Stay safe, remember to be kind to each other. We're all equal, and I hope you have a magnificent day.